do need to change your name, turn your video on or off, or do whatever you need, please do. For the most part, we record for our own internal purposes. It helps with notes, but given the topic and the rich expertise and discussion of today, we'll likely post at least portions of this as an archive. As I mentioned, this event really brings an amazing and diverse group of panelists today that cut across immigration, domestic violence, at community-based levels, in legal advocacy, in policy advocacy, in economic and consumer rights advocacy. And it's been a long conversation and labor of love to bring this to you today, so we're excited. We intended this exchange for those who already work with or have some fundamentals in survivor-centered and culturally specific advocacy for immigrant survivors. So if that's you, we really hope that you, well, welcome, and we hope that you'll join in the conversation. If you're a bit newer and are looking for some foundations, also welcome you and invite you to learn, observe, be challenged, be curious, and join us in this call today. So some other housekeeping, as Mary Kate mentioned, reach out to her if you have any tech issues. Again, we are recording. And because this is a dialogue, a panel, and then we'll have some time for Q&A as well, we really hope that you'll engage with us. A tip that we often offer for that, to help with that, is this trick to affirm, add, or ask. You can affirm what you hear by using that reaction button that Mary Kate mentioned, by putting a plus sign, an exclamation point, or any sort of comment in the chat. You can ask questions to get clarification or anything that's on your mind in the chat at any time. We'll keep track of it and help lift it up for the panelists. And we'll also have some dedicated time later where you can, come on video, come off mute, and engage in direct conversation. So feel free to do that. And then you can add to anything. You all bring your own expertise and experience in your own work, in your organizations, in building partnerships in your community. So we hope that you offer those to the conversation in the chat, or again, raise your hand and we can take you off mute. So with that, I do want to share, for those of you who are newer to CSAJ, we are a national organization that envisions a world where all people have equal access to physical safety, economic security, and human dignity. And we do that in what we call 3 levels of impact, by helping remove systemic barriers, enhancing organizational response, and by improving professional practices. So that is absolutely what's taking place here today. And Kira already mentioned that this is part of our consumer rights initiative. And here's a little flow of show, and I know that all of these folks are going to introduce themselves, and I know that we want to dive into this panel. Before I hand it to Patricia, I am also thrilled to announce that our new advocacy guide, on which this discussion is grounded in, is live today. So you all are getting the first taste of this amazing work. Feel free, I'll drop a link in the chat. Feel free to open it up, thumb through it as we talk through today. And thank you all again. So with that, I will turn this off and hand it to Patricia.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for joining today. It's very nice to see you all. I'm Patricia Moen. I'm Chief of Programs and Administration at Caminar Latino and Latinos United for Peace and Equity. And I have had the great privilege of working with CSAJ and the community partners over the last couple of years, pulling together information about the impacts of the pandemic and strategies that have worked for supporting survivors to meet basic needs of safety, security, stability throughout the pandemic. I am very happy to be here with you all today, and would like the panelists to introduce themselves. So, Katrine, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Catherine Duarte. My pronouns are ella, su, de ella, or she, hers. And I'm an assistant director at the Rape Victim Advocacy Program in Iowa City. And I've been an advocate for over 16 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrine. Sahar, would you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hello, everyone. It's so good to have you here. My apologies, I am a little under the weather, so this is how I sound. I hope that you can hear me loud and clear. My name is Sahar Naqvi. I'm a Fulbright scholar, a trauma support specialist, and a storyteller. I work for a nonprofit supporting trauma survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. As a survivor myself, I love advocating and organizing and empowering other survivors. I do have extensive experience in finance and banking as well, and hence my experience and I'm so much interested in the economic advocacy work through CSAJ. I do work for Dia Inc., which is a culturally specific organization that specializes working with sexual assault and domestic violence victims. I'm really great to be here.
Thank you very much. We're happy that you are here with us as well. And Naomi, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Patricia. My name is Naomi Young. I use she, her pronouns, and I am based in New York City, where I am a staff attorney at an organization called Her Justice, which provides free legal services to women living in poverty in the areas of immigration and family law. And I'm a family law and matrimonial attorney, and I do some consumer debt advocacy as well. I also co-chair the Domestic Violence and Consumer Law Working Group here in New York City, which is a coalition of domestic violence advocates, shelter providers and lawyers in both family law and consumer debt practice. I'm really excited to be here today with all of you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us today. Katrine, I'm going to turn it over to you to lay down some fundamentals for our conversation today.
Thank you, Patricia. So today I'm inviting you to share space in community and to pose critical questions about our contributions to systems of oppression and harm, which when I talk about the our, it includes the I, the we, the us. Some of the information might be challenging, and so remember to breathe. Please be as present as possible. Listen to the panelists with curiosity. As Guadalupe Nogues calls it, listening to understand, using a collaborative mindset. For some of us, society has already trained us to listen to reply, which can create an environment of competition, which can go ahead and prevent growth. So working together with immigrant communities, immigrant survivors, is as diverse and as complex as most work, because each individual immigrant experience is so unique, and there are as many as there are immigrants. Simplification of the work or getting a cookie cutter approach is harmful. It can go ahead and cause erasure, disconnect, and lack of trust. Community work and immigrant survivor community work is beyond connection. You have to build relationship. It has to mitigate tension and constriction in order to create balance. It requires resources. Being the most significant resource, time and presence. For example, there's some common mistakes that I've seen folks creating a brochure and assuming that because the brochure is in a different language, your agency is providing language access and not having access beyond that brochure. Presenting through a concrete lens for an abstract audience. That's another mistake because it centers the presenter need and not the community need. And I want to ground us by starting with a presumption that everyone attending, including myself, has caused harm and made mistakes. And that everyone in this room also has been a target of harm or a target of mistakes. So we are here together to share and learn from each other. We're all experts of our own stories. So take a big breath and here we go. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Katrine. That was a wonderful, wonderful welcome and introduction to the spirit in which we hope to have this conversation. We are here to talk about realities and experiences and solutions and strategies that are employed by immigrant survivors and advocates who support them and the organizations that we work with. So we're excited to bring, as Sarah had announced, the report that surfaced from a listening session that we held back in 2020. And we brought together immigrant advocates who support immigrant survivors and immigrant communities by and for immigrant communities, and had a really rich conversation about what people were going through, and all of the stories will sound familiar to everyone now, with courts being closed and having challenges in getting orders for protection. We had the great fortune of having someone in the listening session from Puerto Rico who could speak to the experience and impact of the hurricanes in Puerto Rico and how communities come together after natural disasters, and how we could take those lessons and bring them forward into the pandemic. Some of the stories that surfaced were very inspiring, and through the conversation with the group, we came away with 4 concrete recommendations for the field. And I'll share those highlights now and hope that everyone will go and check out the report that includes a lot of the contextual information that we spoke about among the group working with Latinos, particularly Latina survivors. The group was focused on working with Spanish-speaking survivors, but also working with individuals with unresolved immigration status, and how many of those intersecting identities and realities can create unique challenges and unique opportunities for advocates working with very diverse communities all over the country. The 4 primary recommendations that came out of the listening sessions were to infuse legal services with cultural awareness, creativity, and prioritize expanding access to justice to immigrant survivors. And this ties into what Katrine was inviting all of us to do, and really reflect in how our organizations support liberation, support survivor-centered and survivor-driven solutions, and support breaking down systemic barriers that continue to perpetuate access to justice. The second recommendation was to redefine success in light of collective loss of the pandemic, create emotional support systems, and leverage online community building. We've all seen the power of virtual meetings and convenings, and now see opportunities where before we were limited in being able to see how we could use virtual platforms to build community locally, regionally, nationally, or internationally to support survivors. And the recommendations from the group were that we continue to invest in these strategies because we can reach more people this way. in ways that meet needs that we can't meet in person sometimes. The third recommendation were that immigrant survivors are creative and have many strategies to secure resources. And as advocacy organizations, court systems, and other institutions that aim to support survivors experiencing violence, we need to work to lift up and align ourselves with informal and solidarity economies, and really embrace the solutions that immigrant survivors identify for themselves. The fourth and final recommendation was that the pandemic increased the need and resources and also identified new investors in creating solutions and implementing solutions. And we need to work to leverage resources and opportunities to invest directly in survivors, helping meet basic needs in creative and ways that maybe we weren't willing to consider before the pandemic. Really challenging ourselves to be as creative as we can to meet the needs and respond to strategies that survivors bring forward themselves. Those were the main highlights of the recommendations. The report includes real practical solutions and applications that advocacy groups and individual advocates can learn about and apply themselves. And we're really looking forward to having everyone have access to that report or that guide and be able to learn from it, implement it, and share what you think about it. We're very excited to have that available in the field for everyone. And we have a lot of gratitude for the individual advocates who participated in the listening sessions, validated the findings, and really supported us to be able to bring this forward to you all today. Now we're going to move into a discussion about things that have evolved since the very beginning of the pandemic. The listening session that's featured in the report happened in I believe it was the summer of 2020. We were all very much reeling, and we've learned a lot since then. So we wanted to bring together individuals who have lots of great ideas and information to share with everyone today. So, Nkiru, I'll pass it over to you to begin our discussion.
Thanks so much, Patricia. Thanks for the intro and laying the groundwork on our guide, which Jazz has shared in the chat. I think we should start with a bit of background, going back a bit, to talk about the economic challenges that survivors faced during the pandemic. So at the beginning of the pandemic up until now, I would like to ask the panelists to answer what they would say has been the biggest shift in immigrant economic needs, immigrant survivors' economic needs. And I would pass this question to Sahar to start. What have you seen in your work with survivors of your organization?
Hello, everyone. As far as the demographics that we cater to, so mainly South Asian immigrant background, we have seen that the economic needs have increased in the sense that, yeah, I mean, housing has been always been a need. It was when the pandemic started, and it is still now. What we saw the shift was that the needs were more long-term. So if a survivor called us during the pandemic, we're still serving those survivors. Our survivors are staying for longer periods of time because they don't feel that they're supported by the systems. Something that I want to bring your focus to is, there was a moratorium, there was a stay order in Harris County for evictions, and that helped a lot. But as soon as that sort of moratorium was expired, when the pandemic was over, which it isn't, unfortunately, but a lot of survivors came back looking for legal assistance for those evictions. So that's one of the sort of like the aspect of what we've seen come back as far as housing is concerned. Another thing is that there's a long-term need for coerced debt, because a lot of people are not realizing when they've been victims of coerced debt. They're signing papers, divorce papers, what have you, without knowledge of what have they incurred during the time of the survivorship, right? During the time of the relationship or what have you. So that's a need that I'm seeing more and more growing through the years. A lot of survivors will say that they sign like for a car loan or for a loan. They didn't know that they were signing something. They didn't understand the language, or they didn't even have they had a language barrier. They didn't understand English at all, let alone like legalese, And I do have a 6-year-old at home who's homeschooled, so he will be joining the session with us. And so, I mean, and this is how I work. So apologies. But yeah, I mean, the survivors, their needs have grown. It's more long-term now. We're not seeing survivors who are short-term. They need definitely, legal assistance. They need job assistance. A lot of times, the basic needs, like applying for SNAP benefits or applying for Medicaid, like, those things are there, but it's more long-term. And we're seeing a lot of survivors come back. So survivors who we had attended to like in the beginning of the pandemic are coming back precisely because housing is such a big need, and because there is such a gap in the systems as far as housing is concerned, that either through RRH or other in-house programs, if we're able to assist them with rental assistance for a few months or a year or what have you, we're sustaining them through, but we're seeing that there is a lapse in how we hope that they thrive, and them not being able to thrive, basically because of so many systemic failures, right? And if we add like protection orders and we add all the legal sort of stuff that happens with divorce and custody, that just sort of adds up to the emotional and the physical sort of apprehension of the survivor, right? So I see, I mean, through CSAJ and many other platforms that we work through, I've been advocating for a more holistic approach to understanding survivors' needs and reaching those needs that are beyond sort of band-aids. We come together as people to provide holistic sort of approach that has legal, economic, basic needs, emotional and counseling needs in one sort of go. Whether we do it as one agency or we outsource this to like other agencies, that's something that needs to be discussed.
Thank you so much, Sahar. You brought up very important points, and I saw some of our audience nodding. Feel free to share similar stories or issues in the chat as well. I'll pass this question off to Katrin, just to speak a bit about what your organization has been seeing as well.
So as I mentioned before, we are in Iowa, and we, most of the counties that we served are rural counties. So at the beginning of the pandemic, we have a lot of agricultural workers working in meat packing plants or in the fields, named as essential workers. So in a small community, we had 32 deaths of Latino head of households. Because also they didn't have access to saying no. So that was very devastating for the community, and for building trust with main organizations or mainstream organizations. And it's still erased. Very few people know about that because it is not something, for example, that the governor will go ahead and talk about, or other organizations that would talk about. So I've seen that. And so that has trickled in the experience of youth, and the increase of mental health seeking for past traumatic experiences. So we get a lot of young folks trying to access services because also of the disconnect between parent and child in the culture, and also the trauma experience, the isolation experience, and the grieving of all of that. And some of that youth are folks that have experienced trauma and are survivors through their migration or through living here as child survivors. So I've seen an increase on that, and for also dual language services and support, especially with the Latino community, because children might speak English, but the parents that might just only speak Spanish. And so they want someone that can speak both, so the entire family is engaged in their healing, in their process of sanación or healing. Another thing that I've seen with the how COVID has devastated different Latino communities throughout Iowa is an increased need in housing, like Zahara mentioned, an increase on financial assistance. There's more people requesting assistance for gas cards, for groceries, for more stable housing. Shelter is not enough. In there, we don't have enough shelters. So trying to figure out if we can partner with different landlords or different other organizations to be able to create more stable housing. And especially now in Iowa, there's in the last few years, school food was provided. It didn't matter about your economic range or if you qualify. That was removed this year. So we are also seeing an increase in hunger because people that were receiving meals are not receiving meals anymore because they don't qualify. So that's been in with there's also a lot of evictions, and we thank the moratorium because that gave us time to breathe, but that is gone out, and you would see how some folks targeted immigrant communities to go ahead and remove them from their homes. and it's very systemic in the way that things happened. Another component is a decrease on social justice or civil rights, civil attorneys that could assist folks with that don't have the resources. We've seen a lot of folks that have passed on that. So harms that might happen in a school that criminal law enforcement might not want to address, but through civil, they could have access to justice. Sometimes it might be shut down because there is not enough folks, or there is a conflict of interest because we're a rural state.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Katrin. I'll pass it over to Sarah. CSCJ did some research on all of this, and she may have some similar evidence and research to share on this. Sarah?
Yeah, thank you. I was just gonna chime in the chat. Everything Katrine was saying, we saw some evidence for early in the pandemic. We ran a national survey of the economic impact of COVID on survivors, and we looked at the data for the report. I can share my screen. I don't want to distract though, but the upshot of that was that advocates who worked with immigrant survivor communities were more likely and more often reported all of the economic challenges that we asked about. And we looked at the top 5 reported challenges across different advocacy groups. And for those working with immigrant survivors, the top 5 challenges were getting food, paying bills, lost income, and unique to this group were the issues of child custody and visitation and risking their health due to employment. So when you mentioned the rate of deaths, Katrine, early on, that's really unique too, and we know that immigrant and underserved survivor populations were, overrepresented among essential worker populations, and therefore faced more risks at home, more risks in employment, more risks with their health and safety in all of the ways that means. And so that matters a lot, and you putting kind of your experience, Katrine, to some of that data and how that continues and is now rippling into how youth are able to grapple with mental health and past trauma, how we see the enduring and kind of evolving food and hunger needs, but still there, and what we need to do to take, I think, some of the maybe aha moments that the pandemic offered, probably more systems and mainstream solutions than immigrant and communities that have been historically marginalized. But how do we take that aha moment and really use it in transformative ways to provide resources that are meaningful and can actually meet the need and allow survivors to choose and direct the course of their own safety. And so that data is very clear, and what you're saying is kind of continued need makes sense. And so this conversation is critical. I'll reshare the link and point you all to where the chart with that data is in the report that Patricia mentioned earlier.
Thanks, Sarah. Pivoting a bit to the legal aspect of it all, I would like to shift to ask Naomi to speak to some of the economic issues that she saw with some of our immigrant survivor clients, and basically just talk about how economic or consumer rights issues present themselves for the immigrant survivor clients that she's had.
Thanks, Inkarul. I do want to echo everything that everyone else has said so far about the impact of the pandemic on our clients. I was, particularly struck when Katrine said that, those deaths occurred because those communities did not have access to say no. And I think that's really central to this entire subject that we're talking about today, immigrant survivors, meaning that there's been multiple layers of systems and behaviors that have limited their ability to exercise agency over their own lives. And I think all of those issues were deeply exacerbated by the pandemic. And I will focus on how that looks in the legal system. And my experience is based in New York City. So I don't know the extent to which this is similar in other parts of the country. Obviously huge differences between rural and metropolitan areas in terms of access to legal services. And I will say that, New York is probably one of the best resourced legally across the country. And we have kind of unheard of rights to counsel. For instance, we have a right to counsel in custody and order of protection cases in family court, and not just in criminal matters. And that's just not the case in most of the country. And we also have more legal services, legal aid attorneys, and a lot of different organizations that provide those services. That said, we've really, really struggled in New York City. So I can't even imagine how difficult it's been elsewhere. One issue I'd want to, touch on is that legal services are deeply underfunded. It's a city, metropolitan area of over 8 million people. And so, having as many lawyers as we do, it still doesn't do anywhere near meet the gigantic need for legal services in the areas of immigration, housing, consumer debt, and family law. And I know my organization has felt overwhelmed by the need as one of the only organizations that provides representation in divorce cases. For instance, it's a really underserved legal need, really, really difficult to find a free attorney to represent in a divorce in a legal system that's considered one of the most complicated in the country. And it's not pro se friendly, but somehow, 94 to 98% of people are unrepresented in our courts. And so there's a huge disconnect there between, how complex this system really needs to be versus an unwillingness to provide, the access that people deserve to have, particularly when there are those language barriers. I would say pre-pandemic, an issue that was particular to immigrant survivors was the threat of immigration enforcement in the courts. And, directly after the election of our last president,
Oops, I think the internet is playing tricks on us. Hopefully she'll be back soon.
While we're waiting for her to reconnect, just because I just went over that data, not shared in this report, but in other places. In addition to these top economic needs, advocates working with immigrant or other culturally specific survivor communities also, I think the stat is 71% also reported that survivors feared seeking help either due to COVID or due to abuse. They were for both of those things, which I think Naomi was sort of tapping into the implications for access to justice and how the actions of the court in how they shut down or limited things. We've seen things in other states that kind of increased access to justice in certain areas by allowing folks to show up to hearings via Zoom and other things. But what courts did could have a huge impact on that, and they made a decision to really limit that, and the implications are clear.
That's great information, Sarah. Thank you. I'm thinking we should transition to a conversation about some of the partnerships and collaborations that you all have seen support survivors through the pandemic. And when Naomi comes back, we can give her the floor again to finish the comments that she was making about some of the unique challenges in the legal system. But even Sahara, as you and Katrine were talking, you hear so many different, many layered systems of experience as survivors are making their way through their decision making and finding a pathway to greater safety and stability for their families. Everything from food security to housing to criminal law to immigration law and consumer law, obviously. What are some of the relationships with other people in systems in your area that have helped create opportunities for survivors through the pandemic? And, can you speak to how you leverage relationships to create additional opportunities or creative solutions? Or creative strategies for meeting needs? Is there anything that you can think to share with the audience today?
Absolutely. One of the things that I have seen personally with a lot of survivors that I cater to is that there is a general mistrust of government and systems, especially if they're coming from a specific background, not having enough knowledge of rights. There's a language barrier. All of that adds up to sort of this mistrust. We've been getting more and more Afghan survivor calls as people are making their way to United States and being settled here. And generally what we've seen is that Afghan survivors, besides not having language access, and Farsi and Dari are very big sort of need right now, they also have a very huge mistrust of systems themselves, and that comes that reflects sort of their own trauma that they have brought from from their home country. That doesn't necessarily say anything about how our systems are, but what they have sort of experienced in their home country, and that sort of understanding what they're bringing in. So for that, we've reached out to community groups, individuals, interpreters, who can cater to that population. Having sort of cultural and religious understanding of, what do they want, what are they requiring, obviously helps in mitigating. I don't speak Farsi or Dari, but I can sort of wing it because I speak Urdu, and what I'll do is I'll start like Google translating stuff, and a lot of Farsi words are in Urdu, so I'll literally like improvise with my English, and then I'll put a Farsi word in there so at least they can understand. It helps for them to understand that on the other line there is someone who who may look like them or understand their cultural background and the sensitivities. Another thing that we've seen is that, the refugees that are coming in also have very complex sort of trauma that that deals with immigration, but also what they may have experienced in their home country, but now having to settle and understand rights and understand systems. I'll give you an example. obviously without sharing too much detail, is that there is a survivor that we helped. Unfortunately, she had to flee from another state, crossing state lines with her kids, not knowing that there's a law that could work against her. And unfortunately, it did work against her, where the sheriff was contacting us, and we had to tell them what was going on. And she ended up being arrested with the kids and taken back to that state because she was charged with kidnapping, and the father was originally in the other state. So these kind of complex cases will tell you, that there's a criminal case involved. Yes, there's basic needs, there's housing, there's there's kids custody, all of that involved, but yet then there's a criminal case involved that sort of complicates and really takes precedence when it comes to these things. I mean, safety is our number one priority, right? And after safety is legal. Unfortunately, in this case, right after when she was safe in an environment, we had to take precedence. The criminal case took precedence to whatever else was going on. On top of that, her own immigration issues and the kids' immigration issues. So, I mean, it's multi-layered, but it can only be addressed if the approach is holistic. And that means there has to be law enforcement. Your engagement with law enforcement has to be both ways, where both the parties trust each other, can be informed. Community advocates and community individuals, organizations, like a lot of times what I'll do is, I know that so-and-so mosque or so-and-so temple has grocery assistance, or they have financial assistance. I give out my clients their referrals because I know that they'll be able to help them. Another thing that Naomi had brought up was financial assistance, or maybe Katrine did, financial assistance during COVID. So what happened was, because there was COVID, financial assistance was given through different means, organizations, to like our organization and others to disperse. That really proved beneficial, because it was literally money or gift card, mostly gift cards, sort of, kept put in the survivors' hands for them to do as they please. 9 out of 10, they use it either on groceries or on their mental health or their physical health or their children's welfare. It was never used for leisure. And that's the thing. And now that we're under normal circumstances, all of these financial assistance have been pulled back. The problem is that, why is it that certain things were made available under disaster circumstances cannot stay? Why is it that we can't make a case for these things where they can stay long term? That's what sort of my frustration has been. But really, uplifting our voices and experiences and our survivors' experiences is what's going to get the policies changed. Having worked with the mayor's office through a housing program and a program that provides job assistance, has been beneficial as well. So there are sort of like a multi-pronged approach to how you can satisfy that need, whether it's the community or an individual or law enforcement or foundations or organizations that are willing to work directly with the survivor. So it's the approach has to be like a big picture where you literally pick each need and say, okay, how can I satisfy this? And for me, at least, it's not been just one referral or one resource for one need. I provide my clients more than one referral resources, because you never know what's going to work out and what's not going to work out.
Thank you for sharing all of that. I heard Naomi is back on the call. We wanted to, you are. There you are. Hello, welcome back. And you had set us up really well to talk about things that influence trust in systems and how mistrust of systems influences help seeking. So if you want to finish your thought about, how immigrants' experiences in the courts influence whatever you were going to say, that would be wonderful.
Thank you so much, Patricia. I'm sorry, everyone. It's like the one day when my Wi-Fi is acting up and it just went out completely. And I was like, either everyone else's Wi-Fi went out and they're all frozen, or mine did. It was me. So yeah, so I was saying, and I'm sure this was happening. I know this was happening all over the country, that ICE was making more arrests and at courts. In New York, there was quite an organized movement to get ICE out of courts, and we do have state legislation that denies ICE officers access to arresting people as they're going to or leaving court. I'm sure similar efforts happened around the country. That's, not to say that there isn't ever any risk or danger, but I think the bigger issue for us, because, we've not seen that happening lately, is that the trust, as Patricia was saying, was broken for immigrants who needed to go to the courts for relief, because regardless of your immigration status, if you have kids that are residents of New York, New York courts have jurisdiction over those kids' cases, and that's where you would go for relief when it comes to things such as custody and child support. So obviously that's a big challenge for immigrants, and I think the big approach to that is public education around you still should go to court. But then, just as like that big public education was going on, like, you should still be going to court, pandemic happens and the courts physically shut down here in New York. And if you were to ask the Office of Court Administration, they would say that the courts never closed and that nobody was ever denied justice in the past 3 years. But I can tell you that I know many, many clients who filed for child support in 2019 who have yet to receive a child support order in New York State. It's disgraceful because the courts decided which matters were considered essential and which were not, somewhat based on, constitutional issues of due process. So, most criminal matters and child protective services cases needed to be addressed on the same schedule as before, although that didn't really happen either. And so, people were having their children removed and not getting access to them in the window of time that they're entitled to. But on the other end, all these other civil matters were considered no longer quote unquote essential. So that has included child support up until about like July of 2020. Nobody could actually file a new child support petition, and there was a lot of misinformation and inconsistent messaging over what aspects of the court were and were not accessible to people. It's still super unclear, and there's a huge backlog and so many like lost motions and petitions that people tried to mail in or file online in an emergency online filing system. That's basically an email inbox that no court clerks had access to. It's just an absolute disaster. So we're seeing the fallout of all of that, in 2022, along with like, I'm not afraid to say, like, a court administration that very much gaslights the population into thinking like nothing wrong happened here. Meanwhile, the non-essential matters like child support were on pause. Once consumer debt cases were allowed to be filed again in July 2020, we were seeing creditors going back to work right away, because I'm sure they were thinking we were out of work for a few months. So I literally had clients that were getting served with new summonses for credit card cases that were super old for $4,000, while they themselves had not been able to get child support in 2 years. It just was such an American experience to know that we prioritize credit card companies and third-party debt buyers over single parents trying to support children when they don't have access to certain public benefits, particularly because of their immigrant status. When they're disproportionately represented in fields like domestic workers that found themselves without jobs in those early months of the pandemic, or still had jobs but didn't have childcare because they were essential workers. And so it was really a rock and a hard place. And I think that's just evidenced nationally by the fact that we have so many women that lost their jobs, that gave up their careers because, doesn't matter that it's 2022, women are expected to be the ones to carry their families no matter what. So it's had a devastating impact. And as Sahar said, level of priorities goes, basic necessities and safety, and then legal. And so it's really difficult for a lot of our clients to prioritize their legal cases when they're just struggling to keep their heads afloat with an eviction moratorium that's, a thing of the past because the pandemic is done and there's no more government economic impact payments going out. We also had a lot of clients whose abusers took the economic impact payments, and we don't have the legal recourse set up to get those returned to clients smoothly. And we've had a lot of emergency sessions trying to figure that out, but that was such a quick window of time that's now passed, and not really an opportunity for federal reform at that level. But it's something that's recurring in the types of economic abuse that we see, including tax fraud and just the taking advantage of one partner's immigration status and their employment status to control the family finances. So thanks for giving me that opportunity back.
No, that's great. Can you tell us a little bit about how your DV Consumer Law Working Group has worked together on any of those issues that you just laid out, or anything that Sahar and Katrine have shared as similar experiences in New York?
Yeah, so I know we're on the topic of partnerships now and how to build them, and love to talk about the ways that I've really benefited from the sorry, I'm looking at Sarah's comment. I'm not sure. Sarah, if you wanted to speak on that.
Sorry, just lifting up what you were saying about systems, government bailing on people. Didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, thank you. Yes, you're absolutely.
Cheers.
That is what I intended. I do not mean that the pandemic is over. That was the quote hands intention. Yeah, so partnerships. So I work at a relatively small legal services organization, and so a big part of our model is partnering with pro bono attorneys at big law firms. But on my own, a big part of my building partnerships has been as the co-chair of the Domestic Violence and Consumer Law Working Group here in New York City. I can't take credit, and I don't want to, for having founded this group. I think it was founded around 10 years ago or so by some of these really incredible advocates, including Dora Gallicatos, who's the head of the Fearix Center at Fordham Law, and Matt at Campbell Legal, the managing attorney at Campbell Legal Services. And so they eventually passed on the baton to me and my colleague, Marissa Mena, who's a consumer advocate. So it's been helpful to have that family law and consumer approach to this interdisciplinary issue of economic abuse. And we are a group that contains advocates from domestic violence shelters, from domestic violence advocacy groups around the city, consumer advocates, and family law lawyers. Some of the work that we've done since Marissa and I started in 2020 has been with CSAJ in their coerced debt working group, doing advocacy with at the federal level, at the state and city level. We recently did a report with CSAJ that maybe Sarah will paste in the chat because she's so on top of that. The reinvesting in economic equity for survivors in New York City. This is an incredible collaborative effort between a coalition of social workers and community organizers and lawyers on the issues that we were seeing, and involved, much like your project, listening sessions with survivors to talk about what they actually needed and what they wanted in order to come up with a policy platform and recommendations. I think it was a super kind of cathartic process for a lot of us that went over a year, because the frustrations that we are dealing with in a legal system that's not only unresponsive and at times super abusive, but denies that they are either of those two things. And to talk to other advocates and survivors who are all seeing the same things, and we're all not happy about it, and feel that hope that comes from coming together and saying we're not we're going to be organized around this, and we're not going to be quiet about it. So hoping to sort of leverage that work with decision makers and policymakers in New York City and in New York State, to say, you know, there needs to be policies that are grounded not in these the way that all of our public benefits are, in shame and punishment for folks who are living in poverty, for folks who are undocumented immigrants, but rather focused on saying, you know, these are human beings who deserve basic human rights, and if given the opportunity, can pull themselves up out of poverty, given a system that just recognizes their humanity. And so I'm still kind of riding that high of feeling a little bit hopeful. We are specifically working on some legislation to define coerced debt in New York, hopefully make it an affirmative defense in consumer debt lawsuits by creditors. Because, you know, recourse against abusers in New York isn't enough. You know, you need to be able to have advocacy against the financial institutions themselves, who are willfully ignorant to what's going on in our clients' lives, no matter how often they're told, and make sure that there's some accountability there, and recourse for our clients. We have been working on talking about some, you know, grants that are low barrier to survivors, to help them get basic access to things like housing and food. Crazy that everyone needs that every day, but it's like a recurring thing, that people need a roof and you know, nourishment. So those are some exciting like projects that are underway. And then there was a real big effort between CSAJ and the NCLs, the National Consumer Law Center, recently to do some advocacy with the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, at the federal level. There was a federal statute enacted that was intended to provide relief to survivors of human trafficking, to have items on their credit reports removed if they were the result of trafficking. And it was the CFPB's task to enforce and implement that statute. So we wrote comments and spoke to the CFPB about how that statute should be implemented, particularly because it was clearly written by someone who did not consult with immigration attorneys or with consumer debt attorneys, and take an opportunity to educate the CFPB that it's, you know, trafficking survivors are certainly impacted by the issue of coerced debt, but so are survivors of intimate partner violence, so are survivors of child abuse by parents, by guardians, by the foster care system, and so are elders who've been abused by a caregiver or someone in a position of trust. And so we need some sort of recourse for those folks whose credit is hurt forever because of a crime they were victim to, or something that's not even quite defined as a crime, but still isn't their fault. The result, the devastating impact, is less access to housing because of the ways in which our system relies on the credit reporting system, and landlords can just deny folks housing based on a credit number, which is absolutely wild, especially for immigrants who are new Americans and don't necessarily have a credit history. And I also just like, and I'll stop talking in a second, just want to point out, just in case people didn't know this, because I didn't know this initially, if you do not have a social security number, you can still open credit cards with an ITIN, because banks do see all humans as profitable, even if they do not see them as humans. And so even though you can't check your credit history online with an ITIN, you can still be getting a credit history, and it could still be super negative, and you could still be sued by creditors. And this is something that new Americans should be educated on. And also, the credit reporting agencies should be giving access to anyone who has a credit history with a copy of that credit history. And that's a huge injustice as well. So that's just like one little soapbox issue. And but regarding partnerships, super important to develop that network of referrals. One of the very first things I did as an attorney was take someone else's list of resources, update it, and I continue to expand it. And have it categorized sort of like in a choose your own adventure sort of format with hyperlinks in it. So this is just like me, but if people find this useful, to say, do you need to think about bankruptcy? Here are the resources there. Do you need to talk about utilities? Here are the resources available for that. And, or do you, have issues with a bank account being frozen? Here are the places I'd call for that. That's been a useful tool to have. And again, I'll say, New York is kind of resource rich, even though all those resources are stretched absolutely to our limits. But there are in that list certain national resources as well, including CSAJ and the NCLC. And so I'd encourage you all to make something similar if you don't have it, and develop those partnerships. Do presentations with your community partners about the work you do and ask them to do the same. I'm doing that all the time. I'm like, I'll trade you one for one. You train us on, how to better serve our trans clients, and we'll give you a presentation on how to get your trans clients divorced. It's just a form of mutual aid between organizations, and I'd encourage that. And I'll go turn it back to you, Patricia. Thanks.
Thanks so much. There's so much that I would love to respond to or dig into there. We do want to leave some time for questions, and I've seen one or two in the chat. But Katrina, I was wondering if you wanted to respond or share anything about partnerships or about opportunities for survivor-driven economic opportunity and advancement. Like, what's exciting that's happening in your area that you'd like to share with the audience?
So the partnership with Kirkwood Community College allowed to create a family sewing cooperative. So they provide a teacher, we teach survivors, we have the sewing machines here in our agency, we have the materials, and then they get the certification, and then they use that to go ahead and do alterations and do other stuff as a source of income. We also have created other support groups, how to make candles. And so survivors have learned how to make candles and sell the candles that they make. We help them put little things together, and then they take it from there. Because of financial need, sometimes I would go ahead and ask a church, because a lot of the type of work that I do with kids involves either food making or arts. And so church donated things so I can make arroz con leche with some of the kiddos and get some of the trauma out of the body while cooking. So we always talk while we do stuff while working with kids so as not to leave them more activated when they go home. So that's another partnership. Also, there are 3 survivor owned cleaning agencies that I have been connected with the owners, which it became this network. So if so-and-so needs, a mechanic, so-and-so knows the mechanic and can go ahead and help fix the car until they can pay for it. And so it's been a network of community helping community, which has been wonderful. And within that also, there was a network of doulas. So that shows you how resiliency and how, hardworking immigrant survivors are, that, okay, give me a challenge. Ha ha ha. I'll find a way. And there is always a way, even though maybe we don't see it, they'll find a way. So those have been kind of cool groups to partner with.
Thank you for that. That's wonderful, wonderful insights and so much exciting development happening there. I'm sure lots of people have questions about the sewing group or the definition of coerced debt in New York, or the cross-state kidnapping situation that you were talking about, Sahar. So please, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I saw one that was about interpretation, and wondering if you all experience better outcomes, or are outcomes as successful using an interpreter service versus in-person interpreting. Can you speak to your experiences on what impact it has, whether the interpreter is in the room with you or not, working with survivors?
Well, I'd like to address that because I don't speak a second language, which means that our organization, and other legal services organizations should really prioritize hiring attorneys who are not like me and actually do speak a much needed language. But because of that, I work with interpreters quite a bit. And I'll say, one, all attorneys or folks providing services should be trained on how to work with interpreters. And 2, that there are different types of interpreters. And so there's really, I think I would say, like a spectrum. So there's the legal interpreters who are in court, and New York has a right to language access. So if you're in a government building, you have to have an interpreter. To be a court interpreter, you have to go through legal interpretation training. And those are super professional interpreters. By that, I mean, you just keep talking, you don't pause, you don't take any breaks, and they speak contemporaneously with you. And so when I'm working with those interpreters, I look straight at my client, I'm talking to them, I'm not talking to the interpreter. And then along that spectrum, I may also work with like my legal assistants or paralegals who speak that language, but aren't necessarily trained as interpreters and do know some legalese, but not a lot of it. And I'll say, I know a lot of my friends who are like native Spanish speakers and lawyers. Just because you speak Spanish at home does not mean that you speak legalese at home. And so there's a difference there. And I am also looking at like our wonderful ASL interpreters who have, I'm realizing when I use legalese because there's like a little bit of a pause, and that's totally understandable. And on me in my training to not use that language and to use it as little as possible. And then even further along the spectrum, I might have to work with the client's family members or friends. And as a family law attorney, I am really, really, really resistant to speaking to someone's family member about their family law issue, even though ethically, if someone's acting as an interpreter, they are included in the confidentiality that protects attorney-client conversations. In reality, that might not actually be the case. And so I need to, be advising my client, this doesn't stay in the room with you and I. It could go out there with this third party who's not a professional. And also, my client's going to feel limited about what they're willing to say to me because of the presence of their child. Or whatever family member. I'm more willing to talk about like a consumer debt issue with the family member because it doesn't involve the family directly. But if they're really asking for a family member to help them out, I'll only do it insofar as it's helpful for the administrative task of setting up another appointment, and then working with someone online, which I know is the question. And I will say that interpretation services really range. We use Language Line in our office. They're also fairly expensive. I remember thinking, I think it's a little more, we have about a better rate now, but at one point we were paying $1 per minute. And when you have a conversation interpreted, it takes approximately twice as long to have. And so I'd see the clock ticking and I'd be like, that's a $60 conversation right there, that I know our organization doesn't have, endless funds for. And so I try to be like really intentional about those conversations, but then I feel like maybe I'm short shifting, is that a word? My clients, because of the nature of that. And definitely just because they are professional interpreters doesn't mean that I don't have some challenges and need to interrupt and say like, please don't have side conversations, etc. But I don't know if others have more to add to that too.
For us, we always use either a language line or interpretation services that are professional. So either for like an intake or a full intake or explaining rights to the survivor, we'll use interpreters for that. We do have like volunteers who are also trained, and they have crisis training, so they can also interpret as well, but it just depends on the need of the client. Oftentimes we'll find an attorney, especially like for legal purposes, we try to find an attorney that speaks the same language as the client, or has some knowledge of that language, because it makes it really hard. As Naomi said, there are confidentiality issues, there are other issues that, side conversations and whatnot. So especially for legal purposes, we don't really use like just, community members or what have you. For other purposes like intakes or just interviewing a client, getting information, that is more relaxed because, and again, these people are either volunteers who have gone through crisis training, so they're more trauma informed, or they're professional interpreters. But one of the biggest challenges that interpretation is expensive, and therefore it's useful to have an advocate or a staff member who speaks that language. We're lucky enough to have several languages on our sort of staff members speak, so we don't run into this a lot. However, having said that, Dari and Farsi, again, a very big need right now, and we're getting more and more people who require those languages, and unfortunately we're not getting enough trained volunteers or interpreters who speak there in Farsi. So that's a language sort of gap that we keep seeing again and again. And we're trying to improvise, you know, as I said, you know, I do speak some Farsi, so I'll just try to improvise as I go, but that does take away from, obviously it's more time required and you have to read between the lines. Okay, what is the client trying to say? You know, do they need housing right now? Do they need housing in like a month or so? Having conversations with other case managers, if for in this instance, like if there is a refugee agency that they're working with already, there is an interpreter there or a case manager there who speaks the same language, having discussions with them. Obviously, the survivor would have to sign, you know, documents that would impact their confidentiality, release of information, so have you. You know, but yes, definitely interpretation is a spectrum, and it just depends on what's the need, and if you have the means to meet that need at that time, or it can be opened up to organizations and community members and see how we can fulfill that need.
And for me, it's very important to have somebody present, because sometimes just because they speak the language, they might not understand the culture behind the language or the word. For example, there is a very common word in Spanish for blanket and for mattress. So this person was saying they threw a mattress at me, and the they threw a blanket. So the impact of that interpretation does not match. And so I like to go ahead and ask questions to the interpreters, like, where you're going to be talking to somebody from Colombia or from Peru. And so what is your experience with that vocabulary? Like, for example, something very simple. In Mexico, a torta is a sandwich. In Peru or Colombia, it's a cake. So same word, very different outcomes. So you want to make sure that the interpreter is knowledgeable. So it gets to be very complicated as well. And that's why I like to have them in person, so I can go ahead and ask those questions. I still do that if in person is not available and you still have to use an interpreter via online or through the phone. I still ask the questions before we get in the three-way connect.
Thank you, Katrine. Go ahead, Kiro.
Thanks so much, everyone. I know we're at time now. Would love to have deeper conversations and longer conversations. Hopefully, this is one of the first of many discussions about immigrant survivors and economic realities they face. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. Sarah put in the chat some of the evaluation. If you could be so kind to fill out some of the evaluation for us, we really appreciate it. We'd like to also thank all our presenters today who have shared their time with us and their perspectives. We're very grateful to have this conversation, and we would also be sharing the newsletter, which is a more the guide that CSAJ developed for immigrant survivors, which is a more developed and more detailed discussion on all the things that on all the issues we've discussed. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your week. Bye.
Incredible. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.